from?
From US.
From the US, okay.
How about you?
We are from,
German?
yes.
All right.
Which part of the US?
We are from Washington, D.C., the capital.
Okay.
How about yourself? You're from
Germany from the south.
So, 100 miles north of Munich,
near.
Bavaria.
Yeah, I never been to Germany. But you speak pretty good English.
Okay guys, it's a pleasure to have you over here. My name is Santiago and I will be your city host for today's War and Peace tour. The idea for today is to learn in detail about the political conflict of Colombia. We're also a small group, so I encourage questions, comments, if you want to intervene, if you want to give a personal experience, whatever, it's super on the table. Yeah, I just want you to know that all barriers off and icebreakers all over if you want to speak. A couple of things before we start though. We're going to be joined by an extra 2 people that are just a little bit late, so they will be in a moment over here. But also about the downtown area of the city. We're in a big city like any other big city around the world. We have problems with pickpocketers, so the recommendation is just be a little bit more aware of your valuables. Cell phones, wallets, cameras, etc. Doesn't mean you cannot take them out. Of course you can take them out, be my guest. I wouldn't recommend you having it in your hand in 2 occasions. One of them if we enter crowds, which very unlikely today. And the other one if we're going through sidewalks where there's active motorcycles going by, because there's snatchers. So in a sidewalk it's maybe better if you have your cell phone in your pocket. Also where to have it. Front pockets are always my recommendation. I would avoid the side pockets of jackets. I would avoid the back pockets. And well, of course, side pockets, usually you don't feel the cell phone against you. So sometimes people bump into you and you just feel the bump, but they easily take them, and they're experts at taking your zipper down and moving away with a cell phone. So this is always better because this is something that you feel a lot more. Second thing, we are super noisy people as Latin Americans. We like to be noticed. Sometimes people would put music at full volume, as you can see over there, and that's across the street right next to the church. So you can imagine the volume that is, so that we can hear it at this volume over here. But I don't notice it because I am from here. I am Latin America. This is super common for me. So I can keep speaking. This doesn't get into my mind, but I understand if it does for you. So if it does, and you tell me, Santi, I'm going crazy over here, please let's move so that I can pay attention to you, that's absolutely possible. If anybody is uncomfortable, I will move. So don't worry about telling me that. And finally, before we officially start, we have a timeline over here of the conflict of Colombia. Hey guys, no, that's okay. Chris, right?
Chris, yeah.
Okay, no, welcome to the tour. You're just in time. So this is a timeline of the Colombian conflict to make things easier for you guys, maybe on the way of the tour, so that you don't feel lost. You can take a picture of this with your cell phone and then know in which part of the timeline we are. Plus, on the back side, if you want any additional information about YouTube videos, documentaries, archives, etc., you can also take a picture of that. So let me start over here.
Yeah, before we start, can I ask you one quick question?
Yeah, please, for sure.
Here in Colombia, is the conflict between cultures, ethnic groups, or the class warfare? Like where the line is divided? I mean, the divisions are.
Depending on where you look at it, I would say there's a little bit of everything in it, but I would say the principal base of the conflict is class.
Okay.
Ethnicity, although some people claim it today because it's a political advantage, it's not a reality. And I will get into that when we're explaining about the precursors of the conflict. Ethnicity at the end in a country like Colombia is not as important as the money factor, or the connection to politics factor. So I will make sure to absolutely mention that in the introduction of the tour.
And other thing is like why the statue is being like face covered.
Why is the statue affected by graffiti and covered in his face? So Colombia is still a country where there's a low-scale civil war ongoing, and that also means a conflict in between narratives. When a narrative conflict is active or radicalization is active, this is a very common thing to see, because the symbols of some might be enemies to others, or might be negative symbols towards their particular culture or identity. So that's why we have a lot of protests. Actually, jokingly, of course, there's serious topics to protest about, but we jokingly say in Latin America that our national sport is protesting, because it happens twice per week, 52 weeks per year. So whenever one or the other comes and the symbol doesn't represent them, they are going to try to affect the symbol as well. Thank you very much, guys. Any additional questions? Again, as many as you have. All right, so as for the introduction of the tour, it says over here in the timeline that we start with the independence of Colombia, but I like to go a little bit further back in the past. Again, because we speak about the origins of political conflict in the country, and we cannot speak about the origins of political conflict if we just speak about the independence. When the Spanish come over here, we're going to get a clash of societies in the area, which is going to be the local societies, European societies, and African societies. We're going to get a mix at the end, so that's why it's important to speak about the three in this moment. First, the indigenous people. And usually Latin Americans have a misconception about the past, or again, today politically used with an advantage, so of course some of the history is lost, is assuming that all of the indigenous people that were present in this area of the continent, in what Colombia is today, were similar, almost identical, had similar ethnicities, similar ideals, religions, languages, etc. And that therefore there were some sort of organizations that were at peace with each other until Europeans come over here. And that's of course very far away from the truth, because they were like any other human organization around the world at the time. They had their own states, they had their own militaries, they had limited resources, so they fought for resources, vassalized each other, they forced labor on each other. So of course it was like any other human society around the world at that time. So it's a misconception to look at them in that way. Just in the case of Colombia, we had close to 1,000 different indigenous tribes in the country before the Spanish get over here. The great majority of them, close to 900, semi-nomadic and completely nomadic tribes, but some of them properly settled tribes. If you're going to visit the Gold Museum, it's in the Gold Museum where you can see a little bit of the settled tribes, how their beliefs were, how the pieces that they constructed were connected to their culture and religion, a little bit of the representation of their identities. And they were very different amongst each other. They had different languages, they had different ways of seeing their religion. Yes, some similarities in the religion, but with very different interpretations. And different languages, of course. Roots, completely different roots of languages. We had Arawak in the north, Caraíbe in the north as well, Chibcha in most of the Andes, and the language of the Incas in the southwest of the country, because that's where the limits of the northern empire of the Incas reached. So very, very different societies. It's complex to put them all in the same box because they were different. Diversity over there. Second group, well, the Europeans. In the case of Colombia, it was the Spanish that got over here. Many people, however, also tend to put the Spanish in the same box. And I don't know if you've ever visited Spain in modern times, but Spain is not a unified country even today. I mean, of course, it's one same nation, but go to the regions of Spain and look where their identities lie. In many of the occasions, especially places like País Vasco or like Catalonia, the regional identity is much more important than the national identity. That's why the regional identity is represented in the flag, in their customs, in their different language, in the different way that they sometimes interpret religion as well. Although, let's say that Spain is supposed to be Catholic, they have different interpretations of Catholicism. So that is today. Now imagine in the past. much more disunified. Yes, it was a single kingdom with a single king, but very different aristocracies that controlled the different regions because they used to be different kingdoms at the beginning. Kingdom of Leon, Kingdom of Castile, Kingdom of Aragon, Kingdom of Portugal, Principality of Navarra, and then the king in Spain was also Holy Roman Emperor, so he controlled territories in Central Europe, countries that today we know as Germany, Austria, parts of Hungary, parts of Poland, Belgium, Netherlands, Northern Italy, Southern Italy, in Naples and Sicily. They were all part of this empire. 80% of the Spanish that eventually got to Colombia were from Castile, central part of the Iberian Peninsula, but 20% of the rest of them from the rest of the peninsula and the Holy Roman Empire. That's why, ethnically speaking, for example, if you go to a city like Medellin, you will notice a difference ethnically with the people of Bogota. People of Bogota tend to be more of a mixture between indigenous and European from Spain, from Castile. But if you go to Medellin, it tends to be a little bit more of a mixture between the indigenous people of the area and people that came from Central Europe. A little bit taller, clearer eyes, blonder hair, whiter skin. So that's basically how it worked out. And finally, the last group of populations are going to be Africans with the very unfortunate conditions of slavery that they were brought over here. The Spanish actually had a plan as the empire to use the indigenous populations of America as a working force or as a labor force. But one of the unintended consequences of conquest, at least at the beginning, because then it was used as a weapon of war, is the transfer of diseases. Amongst those, smallpox was absolutely devastating. We have 3 waves of smallpox in the 1500s when the Spanish get over here. And according to studies today, in those 100 years, between 70 to 90% of the indigenous populations of America, this goes from Canada all the way south to Argentina and Chile, were wiped out because of smallpox. It's of course a civilization collapse event for the indigenous people, but it's also for the Spanish that were looking to use the local population as a working force. It's also the question, who's going to work then? And that's when, unfortunately, they also expand the slave trade into the Spanish colonies, because originally it was a Portuguese thing, then the Spanish, British, Portuguese, French, Dutch are going to get into the trade as well. So most of Western Africa, this is a huge amount of diversity as well for those people that are going to come over here. Because if you go to just southern Atlas or southern, Sahara region, and you're going to see people that are very different culturally, ethnically, in language, in politics, than the ones that you see in modern territories of South Africa. So completely different cultures that are also going to add to the mix. So now to go a little bit more into the question that you asked at the beginning, where is the conflict of Colombia, or where does it lie? Is it ethnical? Is it a caste system? Is it because of class, etc., etc.? And it's a little bit more related to class, at least in our country. Does it apply to the rest of Latin America? No. The Spanish were racist at the time. They had ethnical divisions depending on who you were, where you came from, that made you a citizen with full rights, or a citizen maybe with only economical rights, or maybe not even a citizen. But here in Colombia, we had a colony called La Nueva Granada, where not a lot of Spanish wanted to come. So the Spanish had a pyramid of races. That pyramid had the Spanish from the Iberian Peninsula at the top, then the Spanish that were born over here in Latin America after, then the mixtures, then indigenous people, and finally at the end, the African slaves. So depending on where you were over there, you got those rights. For Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama, part of La Nueva Granada, there were not a lot of big interests for Spanish to be coming over here. And again, there was the idea that if you came over here, you would become rich, that there was gold everywhere. But people, of course, are not stupid. And if you think that you have the basics to live in Europe, and that you're taking a 3-month voyage into America where you might be killed, a lot of people are going to say, well, I'm not going to go over there. At least I have my life semi-established over here. But when there were real Spanish coming back from the colonies of Lima, which had a huge silver mine in Potosí, which is modern Bolivia, or in Mexico, that time was called the colony of New Spain, that had a massive silver mine as well. Well, that was a different story, because that was maybe ensuring that you were going to be able to get some riches from the continent. So many people were moving over there from Spain, so that meant it was easy for the administration of the empire to say, I am going to designate political and economical power over these people that are migrating from the peninsula. But Nueva Granada, despite the stories that there was a lot of gold, yes, there was gold, but it was not easy to extract. So nobody wanted to move over here. There were very, very few Spanish that migrated, and many of them started marrying with indigenous people or with Africans as well. And the Spanish couldn't afford to lose participation for them in politics or in economics, because simply the colony wouldn't work. And that's why those standards were, let's say, not implemented to the country. And that's why the mestizo classes, or the mixture classes, started getting involved in the administration of the state over here. And that is reflected in the independence leaders themselves, although they portrayed themselves as whites. If you go and see a portrait of Simón Bolívar painted at the time, or painted by commission of the same Simón Bolívar, or Santander, which we're going to speak about in a moment, you're going to see them white. And the reason why is because they wanted recognition as an independent state, and that recognition, they wanted it from Europe, and they wanted to look European, so that it would be an easier acceptance of their power. But if you read the diaries and the descriptions of the people about those leaders, you're going to see, that Santander, for example, was a mixture in between indigenous and European, which we call mestizo, and that Simón Bolívar was a mixture between European and African, which we call mulatto. So, yes, as a way of interpreting themselves to be accepted, they described as white, but in the practicality of who they were in terms of ethnicities, they were mixtures. So that's why this is not a colony where race was a deciding factor in terms of political or economical representation. Did it happen? Of course, but it was not the main factor. Any questions or comments up to here? Yes.
Like Portugal had a colony in Brazil.
Yeah.
Do they have any influence, like internally here in Colombia for Portugal?
Did the Portuguese have an influence over here internally in Colombia? Not really. The first ones to get to the continent were the Spanish. The Spanish were actually expanding even into what some territories are part of Brazil today. But the Portuguese were also evangelizing the population, and they decided, and they were strict Catholics as well, so they decided to get a political or geostrategic advantage through the Pope at the time. So they went directly to the Vatican and told the Vatican, why are the Spanish getting everything if we are as devout Catholics as they are? If the Catholics or if the Vatican doesn't serve our interests, then we will no longer serve them. The Portuguese were closely allied with the British, so they were risking moving into Protestantism, and of course the Vatican didn't want that. So the Vatican decided to make a line of division. It's a meridian that they decide by pure chance, in which they divide west of it all to be Spanish colonies, east of it all to be legal Portuguese colonies. That's how it happens, and that's why they semi-respect each other, because the Pope intervenes in between the two sides.
I mean, the reason is like Christopher Columbus came to the Caribbeans, right?
Yeah.
So Brazil is the first country he might be landing on before coming to Colombia. So I was wondering like why Brazil is Portuguese and this is Spanish. So
yeah,
that answers.
That's the reason why, exactly. Any additional questions or comments? Okay, now that is the introduction over properly of why we're standing over here with a statue of Santander. Is because we speak about the independence of the country. We already learned a little bit about who they were, but Bolívar and Santander are going to be the main two leaders of our independence. Probably Bolívar is the guy that you have heard about. You see over here on the left in the portrait, and Santander the one on the right. Great friends during the independence, between 1810 to 1819. Great friends because they were fighting for the same cause, which is getting rid of the Spanish influence in the area. But then they become enemies because they have different ideas or conceptions about politics for the future of the states. So they have different republics in their minds. Santander, the statue, of course, tells you a little bit about him. He has a sword. The sword is over here on his left-hand side, but the sword is put away in the scabbard. Put away in the scabbard, like saying, yes, force or the army gives you power, gives you legitimacy, but that's not the main tool for power in a republic. For him, actually, what's important is the law. That's why the sword is put away. Yes, it's legitimate, but it's the law or the constitution, as you can read over there, that gives you a legitimate republic towards the future. Whilst Bolívar, that we're going to see a little bit later on the tour, very similar statue, but instead Bolívar will have the sword out and pointing forward, and he will have the law rolled up and against his body. So again, it's giving importance to the sword. It's saying it's the sword that gives you power, control, legitimacy over the republic. And yes, the law is important, but always the sword will be above the law, like the interpretation of Bolívar. And the two political parties of Colombia for most of its history are going to rise out of the ideas of those two guys. The followers of Santander by 1848, as you can see in the timeline, is the Liberal Party that is going to be born out of him. They call themselves Santanderists, Federalists, or Liberals. And then the followers of Bolívar would eventually, the year after, in 1849, are going to create the Conservative Party. They call themselves Bolivarians, Centralists, or Unitarists. And Bolívar is a special case because Bolívar is definitely the more influential military independence leader that we had. So everybody wants him as a symbol of their political party. And it doesn't mean that one or the other side is wrong, because both the right and the left use him today, just with different interpretations, let's say. Left uses the image of the young revolutionary Simón Bolívar, and the right uses the image of the old conservative Bolívar that eventually got into power. So symbol for both sides. That's why generally for the Bolívar statue you don't see damage like you see over here with Santander. Santander tends to be a symbol of only one side, whilst Bolívar tends to be a symbol of both sides. That doesn't mean that Bolívar doesn't get damaged. Probably when we get over there today you will notice two things. First, that he has a Colombian flag wrapped around his neck, which is hiding a huge scar because his head was taken off in a protest last year. And the other one that will be very clearly seen is a twisted sword. The sword is not supposed to be twisted. They got it away from the statue, completely damaged it, and the state decided to put it back in that way. Any doubts, questions, or comments up to here?
Like,
Yep.
like for USA, they are like founding fathers.
Yeah.
Are there any founding father or fathers for Colombia?
These two guys.
These two, so they are
Bolívar
two.
and Santander.
Okay.
Well, and the sub-generals, but the people of Colombia don't speak too much about those sub-generals, in part because when Bolívar became crazy with power, he started killing his own generals to concentrate power over himself. We're going to go to that part of Bolívar in just a moment.
In Colombia to the left.
Is the Liberal Party of Colombia on the left? Now, for that I need a little bit more of a longer explanation. Political right and left is always, when you talk to individuals, an individual perception. In many of the cases, that's also why many fights start even without learning the actual position of somebody. They just put a political party on their heads, or they perceive as right or left, and the other as another one. People start fighting without knowing what the policies are. Now, if you speak a little bit more of a nation, also each individual nation has a perception with respect to it. For example, Colombians, in many occasions, perceive the Democrat Party in the United States as being a little bit more towards the socialist left, whilst Americans in general try to perceive it more in the political center, and Europeans perceive it in a different way. So it's complex to answer for that reason. But let's say, more from the local perspective of or where these leaders, let's say, took the inspiration for their parties, there's two big periods. One of the classical right and left, before the 1900s or before, let's say, the spread of Marxist ideas, and then another one after the spread of Marxist ideas. So liberal party was more perceived towards what the original ideals of the French Revolution were. That's actually where the original right and left concept appears, because once they kill the king, they're forming assemblies in Paris in order to decide the future of France. And by pure chance, people and their friends started, of course, sitting together. The ones that wanted the aristocracy to come back started sitting on the right-hand side of the room. And those that want a little bit more to embody the French Revolution ideas started sitting on the left-hand side of the room. So that's the traditional right and left. Bolivar was right, aristocratic ideas. Power for the single person or concentrated in a small group of people. Whilst the liberals were more towards the traditional left. The traditional left being those for the... Sorry, I got distracted by the selling of cell phones. The traditional left or the liberal party following the ideals of the French Revolution. Equality, freedom, fraternity, more towards a republic where power is shared, where you don't have one single elite, but you have power spread in between several elites. That was the idea of the liberals. Post-Marxist era, and that is liberals perceived on the left and conservatives perceived on the right. Post-Marxist era, we can like redefine the extreme right and the extreme left, because post-Marxist era we also get counter-revolutions in Europe with fascism. So that's when we redefine the extreme right as fascist, and we start redefining the left as or extreme left as well as communism, socialism, and then liberalism. And liberalism tends to be perceived either somewhere in the, here in Colombia, either somewhere in the center or right to the political center. So sometimes that's the reason why when people speak about our current president, they tell you the left has never ruled in Colombia until today that we have Gustavo Petro, which of course follows that interpretation. But if you say, well no, the left has also been the liberals, well the liberals have been in power also several times in Colombia. Any doubts or additional questions? Yes.
The left and right, you divide it according to the social norm. But where the money, right? Is it capitalism or socialism? Like how that's divided?
Mostly capitalist. Colombia has been a mostly capitalist country.
So irrespective of your right or left, but they're capitalists.
Yeah, most of them are maybe capitalism, state capitalism in one case, and a little bit more, I would even say state capitalism in the other side. The problem with Colombia is that capitalism in many occasions is for the people that have the money. Most of the rest of the people are not included within the capitalist system. That's the main issue for the country. Colombia sells itself as a capitalist country, but it's more a mercantilistic one, where you have a series of big enterprises that are very intertwined with the government that live in a capitalist society, let's say, but for the rest of the country, getting access to capital is not that.
So are there any socialism, like government handing out for the people and kind of...
I mean, of course there's socialist
welfare
policies in the country. Since the 1940s, 1950s forwards, there was increasing socialist policies that were applied in the country, which doesn't mean the country's socialist, just that some of the ideas are in the creation of a welfare system. We have a private-public mix for health, which subsidizes health for the poorest, or we have a private-public system for pensions, which also subsidizes. So yes and no. Yeah, I would say that would be the answer in the middle.
Okay.
Any additional questions? And just the last thing before we move from here, Colombia used to be a much larger state. This is the original Colombia. Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, and Panama were part of the same country that ended up disaggregating into what we have today, which is this. I'm sure you've seen this in Google Maps when planning your trips. But why did we get to that if we had such a huge nation? And in principle, most of the fault lies in what Bolivar wanted as a state. Because Bolivar starts centralizing more and more power over himself. And eventually he takes the decision that all political and economical policy would be decided from here, from Bogota. That also means from the people in modern territories of Venezuela, in modern day Ecuador, and in modern day Panama. And specifically the elites of Caracas, which is the capital of Venezuela today, and Quito, the capital of Ecuador today, were saying part of the reason that we got our independence from the Spanish is because we didn't want Madrid basically deciding policy for us. Now, why should we let Bogota, that is a very different city from Caracas or from Quito, take also decisions for us? That was not the agreement at the beginning. Also, they were looking more towards the example of the United States. Yes, a federal, or let's call it also national government, that is strong, that is sticking together, but with individual rights for the states or the departments to decide over some political policy, over some economical policy on their own. And when they saw that Bolivar was not going to bend that way, that's when the decision to separate comes up. And even before the death of Bolivar, first Venezuela in 1830, then Ecuador, same year, just a little bit later, separated from the country, and Panama we're going to talk a little bit later on the tour. Doubts, questions, or comments?
I think like Bolivar is much more like a Napoleon than a Washington, right?
Yeah, much more.
Yeah.
Actually, it's a very ironic thing because Bolivar went to see the coronation of Napoleon in France, and when Napoleon took the crown and put it on himself, Bolivar said, I don't want to be that guy. I honor the original Napoleon that was fighting for a republic. I despise the now crowned Napoleon. And he had actually rented, this is more of a myth I would say, and a legend, that he supposedly rented one house, one room, to be able to see the emperor, after being crowned, walking in the streets of Paris. And then when he saw him doing that, he decided to close the balcony doors and the windows so he couldn't see Napoleon. And he became exactly the same thing.
Same thing as yeah.
Centralist, power over himself, and an ego as big as it could take. Additional questions or comments? But still a hero for us. Because again, he is the liberator of the country. Now, our next stop of the tour, 7th Avenue on the left, half a block, and we will stop right there.
You having a good time? Good mood?
Guys, has the volume of my voice so far been okay? Yes? Good. In the moment that you don't hear me well enough, as I was saying, or if this sort of sounds bother you, you let me know. We spoke about the independence of the country, and we spoke a little bit about the consolidation into the two political parties of the country, but we haven't spoken of what the republic became after the independence. And we're standing over here partially because, I mean, up to a certain degree, the elites that you see posted in each of the four corners of the street have affected the way that the Colombian Republic developed. The Catholic Church, after the coming of the Spanish, they made the official religion of the empire Catholicism, and it was also connected to being a proper citizen of the empire. So that's the reason why at one point 97% of Colombians were Catholics. Then with the proper separation in between the state and the church, like things started to lower down, but still Colombia is a very Catholic country with about 76% of its population being Catholic. Many of them light Catholics, but nonetheless gets involved in the way that people vote. So the Archbishop definitely has a political position. That political position, in a subtle way, it's put into the rest of the priests that have to speak about a particular topic in a certain way in Mass. And of course people hear that, and that can be an influence at the end for the vote. So still relevant today. This one right here, when we move a little bit further away, you're going to see it says Banco de la República, or the Bank of the Republic, which is the equivalent of our central bank. This is not just an elite over here in Colombia, this is all over the world. All modern states today have such an institution that manage monetary policy, and up to a certain degree it gives confidence or not with respect to the currency of that country. On that side over there we have media, the representation of media history. That was a newspaper funded by the elites within the Liberal Party, one of the most antique newspapers that is still active today. Media has always been important. I mean, the farther that you go back in time, whatever empire that you look at, even if it's in antique history, you're going to see narrative. The way that that narrative is communicated to the citizens of the empire or of the country has always been key to keep control, whatever they are politically speaking. So narrative is always there. Narrative also always has a bias. When we tend to live in democracies, we also tend to believe that if we stand somewhere in the center, then we don't have a bias. Of course, standing in the center is a bias, because we have a political position with respect to it. But also, if we live in a democracy, usually those newspapers would be in the center, but they're also defending democracy in itself. And that's also, I'm not saying it's a bad bias, I am pro-democracy, but it is a bias that is behind that you have to have in mind. Whoever is behind that newspaper, that man or woman, will always have a political position that they want to defend, and of course they won't want the newspaper that they're funding publishing something different to what they believe. So every single one has a political position. And again, important to keep the narrative or the status quo partially as it is. And the last side over there, because the United States is going to get very involved in the way that policy is handled over here. And we try to be super unbiased in the tour, in the sense that no nation, internationally speaking, will handle policy in a way that it affects its own policy. So they will always go for the interest. Whatever nation you speak about, they will go for their interest. When your interests are aligned with that nation, good things happen. If they're not aligned, well, probably bad things happen to the weaker state. So that's the way that we see international politics with respect to the United States, at least in the sense of the tour, to try to keep it unbiased. And there's also number one rule of geopolitics that we will be discussing during the tour, and that is there's no such a thing as a free lunch. There's always something that you have to keep back if you're getting a benefit. And in the consolidation of the Republic, we're going to get a very divided Colombia, almost 50-50, in between the followers of Santander and the followers of Bolívar, in between liberals and conservatives, as we discussed before. And this cartoon describes the situation very well. You can see it's a fight in between two men holding pieces of paper. One says unitarist, of course, the representatives of Bolívar. The other says federalist, the representations of Santander. And they're fighting for power in Bogota, for the control of the state. That's the representation of the woman that they're pulling from one side to the other, or the representation of the motherland in itself. But they're fighting for it. We had a very equal 50-50, so usually elections over here were won with 50.5 to 51% of the votes, a very marginal win. And we also became a very strong presidential republic. Maybe Which countries do you visit us from?
I'm from US.
US?
UK.
UK? Germany. Okay, so in our case over here, as Americans, and I mean Americans as the entire continent because I'm not from the United States, I'm from here, so all of the people that live in America, we tended to follow the example of the United States in terms of a democracy, which is the presidential system. So when you speak about an American, again, from the United States to Argentina, Chile, because Canada is a parliamentary system, we tend to see the democracy as presidential. But if you go to Europe, in most of the cases, it's parliamentary, like both in the case of the UK with a parliamentary monarchy and in the case of Germany with a parliamentary democracy, which function in different ways. Both democracies, but function in different ways. In a presidential system like what we have over here, the president has a lot of power because they have the presidential decree, and presidential decree can be used to take decisions even without the approval of Congress. Of course, presidents try not to abuse it because it will be seen as dictatorial, but nonetheless they do it. And in a case of a Latin American country like Colombia, it is always abused. Why do they have that amount of power? It's because the Congress or the legislative branch is very separate from the executive branch. Here, when we go out and vote for national elections, we vote for Senate and our House of Representatives, so Congress in general, and apart from it, we vote for the president. So that gives a lot of power to the executive, because that is the people voting directly for them, and that separates the two of those branches. Well, in a parliamentary system, usually what people do is they vote for their representative in parliament, or for the party that they want them representing them over there, and it is the largest coalition or the biggest party within parliament that chooses the prime minister in the case of the UK, or the chancellor in the case of Germany, and they tie them so much more to the legislative branch. I mean, decisions cannot be easily taken separately from parliament in a parliamentary system, whilst in a presidential, yes. Advantages and disadvantages for both. Let's say that the principal one for the presidential systems is that they can handle emergency situations in a very easy way, because you can take fast decisions in the moment when things are happening. The problem of a presidential system is that in the long term it tends to generate radicalization, because people feel more represented in the Congress, where there's a lot more people talking than just by one single figure. And what about if that single figure has 51% of the votes? That's where radicalization starts appearing. Whilst in a parliamentary system, the advantages in the long term, again, people feel that discussions are being had, that democracy is working in the parliament, where there's more representation for the more majorities of the people. Coalitions are usually have to be built in order to take decisions, and that feels democratic. But the problem with the parliamentary system is when they need to take decisions fast. Like what happened in Spain a couple of weeks ago. The decision had to be made, but because of all of the bureaucracy behind taking a decision in the Spanish parliament, decisions to save lives were not taken, and people are protesting in the areas where the dana occurred. So that's the sensation, that decisions are not being taken today, but tends to be more stable in the future. It's a little bit of the differences. And again, as I said, we became presidential democracies. In a country where you win elections with 50.5% of the votes, you have a massive opposition. And when you don't collaborate, and when you simply decide, because we as Latin Americans are very passionate about what we believe, and if we feel that we're from different tribes to the other one, or from a different political party from the other one, we take the extreme position of, now I'm going to take decisions that literally affect you directly without negotiating with you, because I can do it because I am in power. And that of course starts friction in between the two sides. And when somebody slips I mean going into illegal action, the other takes it as an excuse to go into illegal action as well, and that is a very easy pathway to civil war. It worked so well for Colombia that just in the 1800s we had 9 civil wars in the country. You can see it in the timeline. What country can develop politically or economically with so much civil strife? And civil strife that again came from both sides, from the conservatives and from the liberals. Yes.
My question is like, where the judicial system stand on this one?
The judicial system has been very weak in Colombia, with the exception of the last 60 to 70 years. So in most of the time, judges were directly appointed by the people in power at that moment, or by the party in power. So usually the judges stood with whoever was putting them.
So you're talking about the Supreme Court of Colombia,
The
right?
Supreme Court of Colombia, yeah.
So they don't serve for the life, or they have a term limit?
They have a term limit of 4 years. Back in the past. Today no. Today is a very different system which tries to put checks and balances so that you get judges from president to 2 periods before president, period before, and current president. So that tries to bring a balance to lost. They're never going to be able to recover fully, to be able to reinvade. But what about the others? It's partially thanks to the United States. So that's why I was speaking about the McDonald's over there. And the United States is going to, through James Monroe, president in 1820, the 1820s in the United States, by 1823 he's going to declare the Monroe Doctrine, which is saying America will be an area more of influence of the American countries themselves and not of Europe. So if the United States recognizes the independence of a Latin American country, the United States will defend it, will enforce that independence. So if a European country should decide to reinvade and the US has a declaration of protection, the US will join the war on the side of the Latin American state. And that's deterrence at the end. Because yes, you might be thinking about going and invading a smaller Latin American state, but the United States is behind it, its navy and its army, well, as a European nation, you think it was. Now, was it a free lunch? Of course not. What were the interests of the United States behind it? First, legitimacy to the political system. All governments around the world, whatever they are, they try to bring legitimacy to the way that they work. And examples can be used as well with revolutionary states like France during the 1789 revolution. The revolution doesn't stop when you control Paris. The revolution stops when you move the system into other European nations as well. And what is the reaction of the European nations? They say, for us, what is the system that should stand should be the aristocracy or the monarchy. So the idea is to go against France and form a coalition against France because it became a threat towards the government type that we have. Same with the Soviet Union years later. Their idea is not to stop once the Russian territories are controlled. The idea is to continue westwards into Europe, south into Asia, or into America to spread the legitimacy for the type of government that the Soviets had put in the area. And of course the United States had the same idea. We're creating a new sort of republic or democracy that is different from the government types in Europe, and we want to give legitimacy to it so that it's spread around Latin America. So the conditions for the acceptance or for the recognition of the American independences is that they are republics. That's one condition. And the other ones that they're also willing to enter negotiations, economically speaking, with the United States. Because its economy, which is another one of the reasons, what does the United States prefer? To have to deal with a unified continent under the flag of the Spanish. The Spanish were controlling from West United States, that was part of Spain at that time, all the way south to Argentina and Chile, with the big exception of Portugal and some nations in the Caribbean, some controlled by the French, British and Dutch. Or do I prefer to deal with smaller, disaggregated, weak democracies that have just started, that do not have the capital to invest, to take resources out of their land, so that I can invest in those economies? Of course, that was a much better condition for them. If they would have to buy from a European controlled state, they would have to pay that European controlled state. But if I negotiate directly with that country, it's my investment, my capital that is going to that country. So I'm getting two things: cheaper resources and return over capital, over the investments that I'm doing. So that's why the United States wanted that.
But it doesn't work that way all the time.
It doesn't, sorry?
It doesn't work that all the time because Venezuela is an example, right?
Yeah.
So Venezuela is like anti-US, so therefore,
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's been several Latin
Well-
American states that haven't aligned with the policies,
yeah. So therefore they're rebels.
and therefore they go bankrupt, or they have nobody to buy their resources from. Because you could say, yes, Venezuela is allied with Russia and China, but is it convenient to bring oil from Venezuela all the way to Russia or China? How much does it cost, and is it worth paying the extra prime over the oil that you can get in the Middle East, for example, or in their same territories in China and Russia? So of course that goes into play, and Cuba also goes into play. Cuba had one of the biggest economies in the Caribbean region because of the export of sugarcane when Russia was buying it from them. But the collapse of the Soviet Union and the blockade of the United States also destroyed the economy. So it's of course a play for influence. A play for influence that keeps all the way up till today. Additional questions, comments, or debate? All good? Okay, great guys. Our next stop of the tour, we're going to cross right next to the Juan Valdez that we see over there. And we will talk a little bit about Jorge de Sergueitan, that was a political leader in the 1940s.
So how about the Colombian relationship with Venezuela and Ecuador? Right?
Today?
Yeah, today.
So, Ecuador generally has been friendly relationships, with the exception of the first decade of the 2000s, when Colombia illegally sent troops into Ecuador to capture a guerrilla leader, to capture or kill a guerrilla leader in the area. Muchísimas gracias. That's when things soured up a little bit until, let's make a right over here. Soured up a little bit until today. Today the relationships are a little bit better, but still some friction related to narco traffic, because a lot of narco trafficking organizations of Colombia have moved south into Ecuador as an exit point through the Pacific to move north. And with Venezuela, always complicated relationship. Always like fighting, periods of friendship and periods of fights and rivalry in between each other.
Because I keep hearing that a lot of Venezuelans came over to Colombia, Bogota, kind of to escape the hardship from Venezuela.
So the hardships from Venezuela that started 2010 forward made it so that a lot of Venezuelans started escaping the country and moving over here. And a similar situation in the past, in the 1970s, 1980s, when the situation was bad over here, many Colombians that moved over. When I speak about a rivalry between Venezuela and Colombia all the way up till today, we speak of a rivalry between states and elites, but not really amongst the people. When you speak to a Colombian or a Venezuelan, many of us have or had families in each country. And apart from the accent, you cannot really tell the difference in between a Venezuelan and a Colombian. We're exactly the same people, same culture, same food. I mean, we're very, very similar. Colombian, Ecuadorians, and Venezuelans, Panamanians up to a certain degree, with respect to the people. But again, states, different story.
Like, do Colombian government believe in freedom of movement of people between countries or defense of the Venezuela?
So does the Colombian government
Believe in
the
freedom of people.
moving, of people moving? They, I would say in general, yes. In general, yes. And the conditions can be seen with the policies that the Colombian government took when massive migration from Venezuela started coming over here. Just to give you an idea of the amount of people, there are close to 8 million migrations, 7.5 to 8 million migrations from Venezuela in the last 3 decades. In the last 2 decades, sorry. And in those last 2 decades, of those 7.5 to 8 million, 3.5 stayed in Colombia. Legally. The government of Colombia decided to deliver as long as you crossed the border of Colombia in a legal manner and telling the authorities over there that you were crossing, they decided to give people a special permit for permanence or for stay, which is a 2 to 3 year step into getting your residency, and then a 5-year step to get your citizenship over here in the country. So they have been very open.
Did the migrants playing any major part in the political change right now, or
Did the migrants play a role in the political change that we had with the choosing of the new government? No.
no? Okay.
No, no, because actually the government that let them in was today the opposition party. So not really.
Not really.
Do you think in part that openness was because of the previous history where a lot of Colombians moved into Venezuela?
Yes. Do I think that the openness is, let's say, a retroactive measure? Yes. When a lot of Colombians moved to Venezuela because of the difficult conditions in Colombia, Venezuelan government received the Colombians with open arms, without almost any restrictions. And many of the Colombians then that were living in Venezuela, that was the richest country of Latin America at that point, were sending money to Colombia. So the position was, they received us before, we received them. And it's also, I mean, up to a certain degree, migration is always convenient. Because you're getting larger worker force, it's people that are going to come over here to consume as well. So it helps the local situation economically speaking. The problem is when those migrations become desperate, like from 2015 forward, when the economy in Venezuela completely collapsed. Just to give you a little bit of the data, Venezuela lost 75% of its GDP in 15 years. That's a massive collapse. That is people that are suffering from hunger and heavy needs, that are crossing the border by foot and walking all the way, sometimes to Bogota, or sometimes all the way to Peru, to the United States, to Mexico. I mean, it's the most desperate conditions that you can imagine. And of course, extreme needs and basic needs bring desperation and make people take decisions that are higher in risk in order to be able to feed themselves or their family, which of course means crime. And crime brings xenophobia, and xenophobia brings resistance to migration. So we were living that in Colombia as well, because also the media all the time was saying, well, this crime was committed and it was Venezuela. This other crime was, so of course it generates that sensation of it.
So the commonality, language, religion, and culture are common between the countries.
Pretty
So that
much
made it easier for people to kind of openness to move across the border.
To move around.
Okay.
Yeah. It's been very open. My family that lived in Caracas has been living in Colombia for the last 16 years, and they adapted completely. I mean, of course, if you're a small, children bother each other. So they notice your accent and they bother you even if your accent is from another city from here in Colombia. But you can adapt completely and very easily to the local culture. Now guys, we were speaking about the independence of Colombia, the consolidation of the republic, the civil wars. We got to the beginning of the 1900s, and the idea over here is to get all the way up till 1948, where one of the political leaders of Colombia, called Jorge Gaitan, was assassinated right over here where you see this shrine. That is relevant because a lot of people speak of it as the starting of the modern civil wars in the country. So that's why we're going to give a big space for this. And it also changes the city partially. When you look around, buildings around us are 1950, 1960 style constructions, because in those protests or riots after the assassination of Jorge Gaitan, most of the downtown area of the city was destroyed. Maybe if you guys can move a little bit more this way, but right over there above Camiseria Europea, you can see a black and white picture of how this part of the city used to look before the riots. And now today you have 1950, 1960 style constructions. So the idea is to get right there. What happens in the early 1900s? Colombia is a mess, which came from the civil wars that we have talked about. No political unity. we are forced for the first time to create a serious coalition in between the two political parties, which are the liberals and the conservatives. And it's a coalition that is going to stand for almost 40 years in the country. And it's going to bring peace, at least peace in between the two main political parties. Because I've had some criticism. Sometimes Colombians hear the two and they come over here and they say there was no peace. Some people got killed, there were robberies. Well, of course, every country has them. But it was not a major civil war in between the liberals and conservatives. So that's the point over there. It doesn't mean that the country was in absolute complete peace at that time. And it is also a time where Colombia manages to develop politically and also economically, going from the poorest nation, continentally speaking, in America, to one of the average performers in the region. And the final thing, it is when we lose the territories of Panama. In the early 1900s, Colombia was a very weak state because of its continuous civil war, without military capacities to protect Panama, but also with a very big interest over the isthmus, because it is the shortest amount of land or territory in between the Atlantic and the Pacific, right over there. And this was the era of canals, late 1800s and beginning of the 1900s. It was Suez in Egypt, was built by the French, and well, the British of course had money in it too, so it was almost a 50-50, with massive amounts of revenue behind it, because they connected the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, and they shortened the route so that they didn't have to go all the way down to South Africa. It was massive, and a lot of interest was being put in Panama, because it meant the connection of trade between Europe, America, and Asia. So it's a gold mine, and that's why there were many interested in it. Colombia couldn't pay for it because we were bankrupt. There was no capital that we could invest to construct it, so we had to do some sort of alliance with somebody else. That's when the British, French, and Americans are going to come into the decision. To make the story short, because this could be a tour on its own, the United States is going to win the position over building the canal. Because for the United States, it's not just about economics. For the United States, it's about national security. Because if the French and the British build it, they will have to have military presence in the area. Do I really want to have military presence in the area controlling the crossing in between the Atlantic and the Pacific as the United States? And then the second position is, if the United States has a war in the Pacific Ocean, how do I get ships to the other side? Because most of my shipbuilding capacities and concentrations of fleets are in the Atlantic. And of course, somebody is going to invade in the most inconvenient moment possible. Nobody's going to invade in plain summer, where you can easily cross through Canada into the Pacific. And the world was colder back then. There was only about a 2 to 3 month window that you could cross through the north. The rest of the year you had to go all the way down to Argentina in order to cross. So that's why the interest of the United States in it. They win it, they give a proposition to the Colombian government. The Colombian government doesn't like it. They apply for further negotiations. The United States says, we're not interested in further negotiations. They know that Panama is having a hard time, locally speaking, with respect to relationships to Bogota. Colombia became a super centralist state, and those frictions were happening because taxes will be collected from everywhere. And one of the things that you can never save yourself from is of tax collection. But reinvestment in a centralist state happens according to what's convenient to the political classes, in the case of this country, Bogota. So usually the closer that you are to the capital, the more benefits you get from the tax system of the country. The farther away, like the Amazon, or like the Southwest Pacific of coast of Colombia, or Panama, the less you get, the less development you get. And that's the impression of the Panamanians. So the US knows that there's a political sector within Panama that wants the independence from Colombia. They will approach them directly. They will tell them the exact same proposition that they had for Colombia, but instead for them, and that they would enforce the independence of Panama. And that's how in 1903, Panama accepts the deal. That's when they separate from Colombia, they get their independence, and that's when the construction of the canal starts. Doubts, questions, or comments up to here? I'm going to split this into three because it's a long
The
story.
reason is, right, if Panama is a part of Colombia,
Yeah.
Colombia didn't even build a road to Panama. There's
Wouldn't
nothing.
even.
You have to only go by
Nothing.
ocean, right?
Yeah.
I mean, before this is aeroplane. So why they didn't even have a connection between like Colombia and
So-
like Panama if they want Panama to be part of Colombia?
So the problem is the Darien Gap. The Darien Gap has a ridge in the middle in between Colombia and Panama, and it has a super dense jungle. At that time, the distance from the closest city, let me show you over here. Closest city to Panama was not actually over here because this is a dense jungle. This is a dense jungle over here in the Pacific. The closest city to Panama was over here in the Caribbean.
So how many miles was it away from?
Panama City is almost right over here,
Uh-huh.
which was one of the first cities that you could get to. It's about 500 kilometers of nothing in the middle. When you think about building the road, you could probably build it, but to maintain that road in a very dense jungle where you get
Landslides,
all the time, very rainy region of the continent, it was not practical. And the distance from here, from Cartagena to Panama, to well, the other side, which is Colón, because Panama is in the Pacific coast, it was about the same 500 kilometers, but a very easy way by ship.
So there is no horse trail or anything exists between those places.
Today, yes.
Uh-huh.
Not a serious road, but now because of geopolitical reasons.
Uh-huh.
Because it's not convenient for the United States, for Panama to have relationships and dependencies on Colombia, and also because Panama doesn't want to be part of Colombia any longer, so they don't want to depend economically in terms of trade from Colombia, because at the end, I mean, if you go to practical matters and you have two countries that are joined by a road and both work with trade, the one with the biggest economy will always have the say over it. And despite GDP per capita being higher in Panama, gross GDP in Colombia is
Way more.
so that's today. Today you can build the road. Today there's the technology, you can maintain it with almost not a lot of money behind it.
No, the reason for asking is like for most of the migrants who are going north, Colombia seems to be the transit point.
Yeah.
So they were able to cross into Panama somehow and
Yeah.
go by road. So therefore,
you take mud trails, you take, I mean, it's a trek at the end.
okay.
A trek where, unfortunately, a lot of lives are lost. So it's a jungle, animals, snakes even. This is handled by narcos,
Okay.
narco trafficking organizations. And at the end, it's, a lot of people don't see it like it, but for me, it's human trafficking. You're paying to carry humans, like they were animals,
Across,
across from Colombia to Mexico practically. So they don't care about their lives.
okay.
If they get killed, they get shot, if they break a leg, I cannot carry you out of here,
You're on your own.
you're on your own, this is a gun, or you take a bullet and the rest of us continue. It is the most crazy thing that you can think. But it's, again, through trails where there's no control of any state. Colombia's government doesn't have
Any control over
presence
that.
in the area. Panama's government doesn't have presence in the area. And again, this sounds terrible because this is of course not the way that I think. But if there's no geostrategic or resource interest in the area for the government is they're not going to be there. They're not going to be there.
So is that area still under FARC control?
They're under narco traffickers' control.
So FARC
As
is the
paramilitaries.
FARC.
FARC is on the more east and southeast of the country.
Okay, so it's a different group
Yeah,
altogether.
it's a different group. Additional questions? Okay. From 1903 to the 1930s, we're going to get a semi-stable government. As I said, they made a coalition between liberals and conservatives. Colombia is going to have bad relationships with the United States, at least at the beginning, because of the conditions of the canal. But eventually and slowly, relationships are going to build up again. because the United States wants to invest in business over here. What business can Colombia give to the United States at that point? I know it sounds crazy, but it was bananas. And bananas, why was Latin America of such importance, or Northern South America or Central America of such importance for the United Fruit Company, that was one of the largest multinationals at the time? Is because we're close to the equator, and when you're close to the equator, you don't really have seasons. Yeah, you can grow fruits all throughout the year. This is a northern town in Colombia, and you can see the scale of the amount of bananas that were being taken out. So that's why the company was interested over here. It originally brought conditions of investment that helped everybody, but it's going to become a problem in the future for Colombia because it captured the state of Colombia. So what's the position of the company when they're going to come over here in 1912 is they look towards the past, they don't know. We have the historical bias today. We know that the coalition in between liberals and conservatives worked, but they didn't know that at the time. So the company says, we're going to bring and invest in roads, railroads, ports, everything to be able to take the bananas out. We're going to have to put a big investment over here. And we're not just about to lose it in the next civil war in Colombia in 4 to 8 years with a change of government. But they probably went with the wrong strategy behind it, or the one that looked the easiest for them, which is go directly to the big leaders of the parties, in conservatives and liberals, and promise them an amount of the money coming out of the company. The problem is that they're not investing it in the party or in the state, they're giving it to an individual. That money will never see the lights of the public in Colombia, and that's obviously corruption and manipulation at its highest level. At the beginning it won't affect, brought so many benefits in the short term that people won't notice it at that time. There was no proper monetary system in Colombia, and the company is going to start paying workers money. And why is that useful? Because if you're in the Northern Caribbean coast, you have no access to banks or money, you trade with what you have. If you grow coconuts, that's your money. If you grow rice, that's your money. If you fish, that's your money. So, and it's unpractical. How many coconuts can I buy with a fish? How much rice? I mean, it's super, super impractical. So that's why it brought many benefits to the local population. Local population could start moving around. The roads were not only going to be for the company itself, but for anybody that wanted to use them, and that also meant people that wanted to do business and bring materials to the coast. So it's benefits for everybody. But the position of the company in the long term is revenue. There's a specific amount in the long term that you can save through logistics, through making those roads, those railroads, etc. But then in a company that depends so highly in a labor force, that's the next objective. And for the company it was to reduce costs. And you're not just going to come and say to the workers, next year I'm going to pay you less, because that starts the season of our national sport. Definitely protesting, of course. But you can do it in the mid to long term, in a semi-secret way, or at least manipulating the information as an educated person of economics. So you start paying year after year a bigger salary to the workers to keep them happy, but that salary will be a little bit less than the inflation rate of that year. In practical, real terms, economically speaking, that salary is worth less. And you don't feel it in the short term, but give it 5 to 7 years, and you're going to start feeling it in your pocket, because you can no longer pay for food, rent, for any of the services that you get in the area. People are displaced economically to other areas where they can pay for the stuff. And that's going to generate resentment, problems against the company. The company will not budge in negotiations. And by 1928, those smaller protests are going to aggregate into a massive riot. And that riot, the government doesn't want to intervene. The government doesn't want to intervene because if they go with the company, that clearly means a delegitimization of the state, and there's elections in the beginning of the 1930s. This is December of 1928. So it's practically less than 2 years before you go to elections. So the government doesn't want to get involved in that. But they also don't want to go with the people, because many of those big politicians have money from the company that is going to their private pockets, and they don't want it to be affected. So they take a position of being away. The US, however, forces an intervention, because by that point the United Fruit Company is a very large and profitable company. So there's a lot of stock owners that are within the US Congress, and they're going to pressure the government to do something about it. That's when the US sends an ultimatum to Colombia, telling the government, either you act or we act, hinting towards an invasion. That's when the Colombian government sends the army, and an unfortunate series of massacres start happening in the north of Colombia. We call them the banana plantation massacres. This is a newspaper article of that. You can see, I mean, if you can read some Spanish, but it basically says 100 people killed, 238 people wounded.
What's the date? 1939?
1928, December of 1928. So, of course, the government loses legitimacy, and 2 years later, they're going to lose the elections to liberals. Most of the first couple of years of the coalition was conservative presidents keeping the coalition, but from this point onwards, it's going to be only liberal presidents keeping the coalition. People saw the betrayal, saw it as a betrayal of the Conservative Party to the people of the country.
Do the government have any other choice?
I would say no.
Negotiations, nothing. They can't
The government
negotiate.
tried to pressure the company into negotiations. The company, however, defended that they were not going to enter negotiations because they were giving good conditions to the workers. Now, that is a very big discussion, because of course if you bring that to today, there were terrible labor conditions for the workers. But now if you take it to that time, the legislation was not there. I would say it was more a lack of power from the syndicates of the banana companies, and that it was actually mostly a local thing in between local leaders that didn't align for the benefits of all, but just for the benefits of a few. It's complex. Many of the people today will say it was unfair, it was the fault of the company, the Colombian government should have done something about it. But like Panama, could we really do something about it? Maybe the best things that we could have done is negotiate with the United States, and at least they get the canal after 99 years. But
I mean, the reason is nowadays what they do, right?
yeah,
The government will pitch in the difference.
yeah,
They provide schools, all the benefits, free health care for the workers. So therefore, the company doesn't need to pay the living wages.
the living wages.
But
yeah.
the government will pitch in from they may tax the company higher.
Yeah.
Or may they tax the other companies and funnel that through that. Because at the end, the workers are asking for much better conditions and money, right? So instead of the difference, instead of pulling from the company, the government can pitch in, right?
Yeah, I mean, and that would have probably been the proper decision to take.
Uh-huh.
But when you have a certain group
Jury.
of elites,
They
Colombia
think
in that
everything can
sense
be
is
done
not
by
a proper
bloodshed.
democracy. Well, they're more interested in the short-term benefits that they can get from it, and then maybe take the money outside of the country. I don't know. Or do I negotiate and then maybe get less of that money? And the way that they see it is, at the end, I brought these guys to the country. I don't need to negotiate with you. You're getting the salary that you deserve. So it's a very, very difficult thing.
My other question is, like, during that period, World War I was going on in Europe and
Yeah.
in America. How is Colombia impacted by that? Did they send armies in support of Spain,
No.
or they didn't do anything?
In the First World War, South American countries don't. The only one is Brazil. The rest of us, and they start training troops, which they never send to the war. But in the case of Colombia, we never got involved. We got affected by the economical crisis behind the
But
First
it's like
World
the
War.
people were in support of Spain.
The people were not really in support of
Any
anybody.
countries fighting in the Europe?
No. It was seen as a faraway conflict with no inherence in local politics or economics.
So none
Although
of the Colombian participated in any French wars in France or Europe? None.
that's in the Second World War, though. First World War, nothing. But Second World War, yes. So that happens after that, 1930s. we get the loss of the country by the conservatives. The liberals take charge of the coalition because they're still in coalition. And the liberals are going to make a lot of promises that unfortunately they're not going to be able to deliver. Because that's when those negotiations come in. Okay, we are the state, we can legislate, we can bring better conditions to the workers in the banana plantations. And we can bring more of this wealth that is coming into the country to spread a little bit better in between all of the populations. But first, they don't win the elections with a huge majority. And second, 1929 financial crisis is going to make all of these projects difficult to implement. 1929 financial crisis also brings a lot of the radicalization that is brewing in Europe. 1917, just before the war is finished, Russia enters into a revolutionary period, and by 1924 the Soviets come out victorious, spreading the Marxist ideas according to their beliefs. But also Europe hasn't been able to fully recover after the Second World War in 1923, 1924. Economic conditions are dire, and that's also why populism on the right starts rising over there. Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, Franco in Spain, Salazar in Portugal, and of course you can keep on going with the list. And we have economical connections to Europe. We have political connections to Europe. So the Conservative Party starts moving more towards the right over here, and the Liberals start moving more towards the left over here, breaking that union that they had kept for such a long time. Then the Second World War comes in, and after the Second World War, the division of the world into the new Cold War, two main victors, the United States and the Soviet Union, are going to fight for influence in the world. And I'm sure you have heard about the first, second, and third world nations, which today we use a lot for economics, but the reality of it was political. If you're a first world nation, it's because you joined NATO or were an official ally of the United States. If you're second world, it's because you officially joined the Soviet Union as a Warsaw Pact or a Soviet Republic. And finally, third world, those that are unaligned up to a certain degree, but where a battle of influence in between the Soviets and the Americans is going to start. Of course, Latin America is closer to the United States. Mostly third world in the sense that we didn't align officially with anybody. But the United States was trying to make deals in order to avoid the rise of communism in Latin America. So the conditions were, we're going to create an organization. That organization was to be named the Organization of American States, still active today. In this organization, the deal is the United States dictates certain policy, including the no communist policy, and in exchange, Latin American countries get investment from the United States in development and also in buying the raw products or resources of Latin America. So practically all of them join. This is what's happening at the time. Also at the same time, Jorge Eliezer Gaitán starts rising as a politician during the 1930s and 1940s. And he eventually becomes the leader of the Liberal Party of Colombia. But somebody that wants to change the way that politics are done, both locally and internationally. Locally speaking, he wants to get rid of the traditional establishments. He says, we're no longer going in this ideology of the conservatives against the liberals. We're now going a little bit more towards, it's really the people against the elites. And many of the people within the Liberal and the Conservative Party being within those elites. So that is our position towards the future, which of course was a risk for the establishment politicians. And then afterwards in international politics to maintain neutral, to maintain doors open with both the United States and the Soviet Union, which was also not convenient for the policy of the US. So when we get to 1948, the Organization of American States is going to be signed over here in Bogota. Jorge Eliezer Gaitán is now at that time the main candidate for the elections of the Liberals in 1950. He comes out for lunch, he gets shot and killed over here in the streets, and that's what started those massive riots that I told you about at the beginning of the stuff. Who shot him? Biggest question mark in our history. Well, we know the name of the guy, Juan Roa Sierra, but why he did it, he was following orders from somebody else. It's like our Kennedy assassination. Depending on the political position or the idea of a lot of people, they will tell you a different story, and many of them very logical. Some of them tell you about a random assassination, others tell you about the involvement of the Soviet Union, some about the involvement of the United States. And it's logical explanations, but there's no hard evidence. So that's what we have.
So was there any Cuba involvement, any conspiracies over there about Cuba?
Can you repeat the question, sorry?
Assassination, right? USSR and US. But was the Cuba or any other South American country involvement in that? Any?
Apparently not. Like, if you ask me the question, I would answer you as Santiago, which take it with a grain of salt, because that's me. I would say it was a local assassination blamed on the outside, because once you blame it on the outside, you don't need to do a serious investigation. Cuba was not yet communist at that point, because this was before 1960 or 1961 when the official changes made. So Cuba was not there. Other Latin American countries were handling their own businesses. Soviet Union, unlikely to assassinate the only candidate that is vouching for open relationships with them. United States aligned with the assassination, but didn't likely have a hand, because Marshall, Secretary of State, was over here signing the Organization of American States. Why put him at risk? And second, Freedom of Information Act passed in the US Congress. It declassifies a lot of old documents, and most of the assassinations that were done by the CIA or related organizations, NSA, etc., are recognized over there of Latin American leaders. Jorge Eliezer Gaitan is not there. Jorge Eliezer Gaitan is described in CIA documents as being one of the candidates, but not as a target, simply information about the candidate. So it's unlikely that the US did it. Most likely thing, Jorge Eliezer Gaitan was a risk for the establishment, for those politicians that had always been in power in both the Conservative and the Liberal Party, and this was an easy way of getting rid of it, especially that day, because a lot of international attention in Colombia because of the Organization of American States being signed over here, and you can easily blame it to somebody outside. That's my perception, but again, grain of salt.
It's like, as a Santiago and the people on the street, what's their opinion about Europe and US in general?
The general people, depending on their political position. Usually, when on the right, a little bit more towards pro-American position. Europe is a special case. Let's speak about Europe after. And if they're more on the left, they're more anti-American. This is connected to the civil war that is going to start over here, and you will know why. Soviets supported the guerrillas that rise up over here, and Americans will support the government that in many of the occasions was right-wing. So that's why the division. With Europe, it's a little bit general. I would say that the general position from right or left with respect to Europe is welcoming. That the only negative positions towards Europe is when people remember the past, historically speaking, which I also believe is a very political thing today. Not so much about the reality of what happened, but if it's politically convenient for my party to be in favor or against the Spanish in respects to the conquest. Because a lot of people today will say, if they're pro-Hispanists, they're going to say, well, it's the Spanish that brought the political system that we have today, that managed to get this country civilized up to a certain degree, to industrialize up to a certain degree, etc. But if you're anti-Hispanist, you're going to say all of the problems that we have today in forms of corruption, in forms of civil war, in forms that we treat the people because of the massacres that happened back at that time. So it's more of a political convenience than a reality.
So is there any political party stands on a platform where they're trying to get the pre-Spanish culture and those things back? Like Inca civilization, something like that.
That they want pre-Hispanic
pre-Hispanic.
I mean, in general, I would say all of them bring some sort of honor or treatment in a different way to indigenous people, because we do feel an indigenous connection. As I said, most of us are mixtures. But like a political party that focuses on it, no. Maybe the left is a little bit more pro bringing justice to what was done in the past. But then usually the people ask, how? Does your 40%, like in my case, I did the ancestry thing. Does my 40% need to pay my 60% reparations for something? Aren't we in a democracy where you're judged by the content of your character and not the people before you? Because if that applies, then you're responsible for the crimes of your parents too. Do we want to go that way? I mean, loads of questions and very impractical, so that's why it's not in the base of the debate. It's more on the sidelines of it. Okay guys, so we're going to go to our mid-tour stop. It's just 2 blocks away from here on the right, not mid-tours, like 3/4 through. A couple of blocks over here on the right. We'll do a little bit of a rest. I know some of you might be tired of hearing my voice. So we're going to take some coffee, some restrooms, maybe a 15-minute break, and then we'll get back together so that you can come back rested and with full energy. Let's go this way.
Are you college educated?
I am college educated, yes.
So what's your specialization? Like political science or?
So I started with engineering. I am an engineer, and I do still consulting in projects for engineering.
Like which part? Like mechanical, civil?
Industrial.
Industry, okay.
Yeah, industrial engineer. And then in order to be able to be a guide, you need to take some
kind of local
technical and local history things. And I've just recently finished a master's degree in geopolitics and international relationships. But history has been a passion of mine.
I know, it's
since I was a kid.
Like, my wife wants to know.
Yeah.
Most of the people work in what kind of business here in Bogota?
Most of the people that you see around, or you mean the big business?
What's your question?
The big business is the financial sector. So that's the largest contributor of the GDP to the city. Yeah.
Because she saw many people wearing like formal dress, like they work in financial
sector. Financial sector and investment firms and banks.
How about mining, emeralds and all that?
That is important for the country, but not in terms of the city. The city is important because, as I said, centralist country. Most of the businesses have to have some sort of office over here to be in contact with the government and legislation and everything. But the highest contributors nationwide to the GDP is hydrocarbons, oil and gas, the first two, followed by coal and other subsidiaries of coal, and then minerals. Minerals like emeralds, like precious metals, gold, silver, platinum, copper, nickel, coltan today. Coltan is starting to be a big thing. And then after that, we have coffee, cacao, and still bananas, and other fruits, flowers. That's basically it for the national GDP. So we're still very heavily dependent on commodities, which is an issue because whenever the price of those commodities fluctuates, well, we have.
How about information technology?
Information technology is a growing industry. It has become increasingly relevant in the country, but it's not as developed as other nations in Latin America. However, interesting point like Brazil. Brazil is massive with respect to it. But interesting point. Colombia had its first unicorn. Unicorn is first billion.
Startup.
On the technology, the IT sector, which is a delivery app called Rappi.
Okay.
So they're the first unicorn of the country, and it's in.
I think like that's what like most of the time like either the taxi cab like Uber or delivery apps or those kind of, or internet something.
Yeah,
So those are the
those are the ones.
yeah. Or
It's
like,
a very fast-growing sector.
and other thing is like I noticed most of the like give importance to education here, right?
Yeah.
So I see like tutoring centers and after-school activities, right?
Depending, I mean, there's the availability of it. Unfortunately, publicly speaking, there's not too many good options behind it. So if you have the money, being in the middle class or higher, you can get access to those sort of activities.
After-school activities for extra help.
Activities. But if you're not, although the barrier is lower, because with so much education that is happening in the online part in IT, well, it's easy to get access to that education. You pay a course over here where there's 25 students for 3 months, and you can be paying up to about $150, which is close to the minimum wage per month over here in the country. That's a lot of money. Or you can go to Udemy, which is an online education, and you pay $5 and you get the same information. Probably not the same attention, but
So for Colombians, which is the first country they try to migrate?
to migrate. Give me 1 second, I'll
Sure.
give you everybody the space and then I'll answer.
Sure.
So this is, guys, the place where we can have something to eat, use restrooms, etc. We have Olímpicos, Torrado, Mama, Oma, and Café Quindío. You can choose whatever you wish. And we will meet at 12:05. That's 15 minutes. Right across the street where you see the two men talking. So that's where we will meet at 12:05.
Okay.
Awesome, guys. See you in a moment. Hey, you were saying?
So which country they try to migrate?
More to the United States.
But they need to be fluent in English, right? So will they able to get those fluency?
Many people even don't go with fluency in English, and they go to southern states. So some of their objectives are Texas, their southern
Florida,
parts of New Mexico.
Florida.
Yeah, Florida. Yeah, Florida. Everybody speaks Spanish. Some parts of southern Georgia, South Carolina.
California maybe sometimes.
Yeah, California sometimes.
New Mexico.
Yeah, New Mexico. There's some on the south, however, that they avoid, like Mississippi,
Are
Tennessee.
you having coffee
Missouri.
or anything?
Yeah, I'm going to Café
I'll come
Quindío.
here. I'll treat you.
Thank you
while
so
talking.
much.
Yeah, come on.
Thank you very, very much. You're very, very kind.
It's really I'm enjoying it. So
Thank you. No, I love that. This is when I have so many questions. I super enjoy that because I know people are liking it.
I mean, the reason is like I was born in India.
Yeah.
And I'm really migrated to United States in 30 years. So so kind of getting the history and
The
all
history
that.
and
Yeah.
everything, of course.